Well, thanks everyone for coming. This is the first in our series of Black History lectures. And what this particular lecture is going to be upon, or be on, is looking at education. Now, I've called it 2020 Vision for the Future because 2020 as a concept within the British or within the English language, meaning something of clarity or for clear vision. So this is what it's about. Unfortunately, the coronavirus has hindered our relationships, our social movements, our social interaction with one another, etc. But the reality is that we're looking for a better vision for the future. So we'll make a start now. Right, so these are the lectures which is going to be over the next coming weeks. And one of the participants kindly did all this for me. So Richard, I thank you very much for preparing these weekly presentations for me in the sense of a flyer. So this is a very important thing. So people know exactly what's happening now to keep you up to date on what's going to be taking place over the next 4 weeks. So next we're going to be looking at Black history from a historical perspective. And then obviously the week after, which is the third week, we're going to look at it from a sociological perspective and also from a psychological perspective, which will be the last one. So for this afternoon's presentation, it's going to be split into 3 different categories. So the first category we're going to be looking at is the racial composition of the ancient Africans, especially those who were Egyptians, because there's a lot of controversy, unfortunately, about who the ancient Egyptians were. Even though Egypt is an African country, unfortunately, through Egyptology, when Napoleon went in the late 1700s, there's been some sort of misconception taking place of who the original ones were. So we're going to be breaking that down because we need to break that down, the racial composition, in order to understand they were Black and African people that created the most sophisticated educational system in the world in ancient times. The second part of the presentation is going to be looking at the educational institution themselves. So we're going to be looking at Ipet Isut, one of the major university complexes that was constructed in Africa. It had over 80,000 students. And then later on, which is going to be the last form of the presentation or last part of the presentation, we're going to be looking at Black history in the modern curriculum. We're going to be looking at the national curriculum. We're going to look at the official curriculum that took place before 1988, before the Reform Act. And we're going to be looking at the new Welsh curriculum in relation to how they're thinking of developing it, how they're thinking of presenting it to the pupils, and what the teachers themselves have to understand about their own delivery as far as the instruction is concerned and classroom management. So let's look at the racial composition of the ancient Egyptians. So here you can see there's an ancient Egyptian on the left-hand side of the image. You can see this is an old image, a structural image of an ancient Egyptian. And then you see on the right-hand side of the picture, a Black or African person with the same hairstyle. So this shows the cultural continuity within Africa itself. So this is showing you the cultural continuity, the anthropological evidence to show there is a cultural relationship between Egypt and the rest of Africa, especially within antiquity. You have another image here. This is an ancient Egyptian female. And what you'll find here, obviously the nose is broken. So we usually find when noses are broken from statues, etc., it is trying to disfigure the image in order to try to display another form of individual. In other words, what I mean by that is they're trying to de-Africanize the images. So this is what this is really about. But you can see, even with the nose broken off, that is an African woman. You can see the thick lips, you see the projection of the jaw, you see the high cheekbones, etc. And then on the picture here, this was taken from the tombs of Ramses III. This is around about 1200 BC. And you have 4 characters. You have a Black person in a robe. Then you have another type of person, slightly lighter in skin color. You have another dark person in a robe. And you have another lighter skinned person. So you've got A, B, C, and D. So the first one you see is how the ancient Egyptians saw themselves. So this is the ancient Egyptians testifying who they were as a race and as an ethnic group. This is what this shows. This is from the tomb of Ramses III. The second one, or B, is how they saw the Indo-Europeans at their time. This would have been the Hittites, the people who lived round about in Turkey. Then if you look at C, that is the image of the rest of Africans. And if you look at the clothes of A and C, one of the things that you'll notice that they're quite identical. So they didn't see themselves as being different to other Africans at that time. And D is your Semitic type. So you have three different types of racial classifications that was understood in ancient times by the ancient Egyptians themselves. This is their pictorial evidence, which are found on many of the caves or the tombs. Here, if we look at it from a biblical perspective, we're looking at genealogy or genealogy. So if you look at the sons of Ham, Ham was one of the sons of Noah. And if you look at the left-hand side now, you'll notice that the children of Ham, or the tribes of Ham, divide into four different sections. You've got Mizraim, Punt, Cush, and Canaan. Okay, so if you look on the left-hand side, Punt is where they say, or what they think is where Libya is today. So all the people of Punt, for instance, had settled in the place which is known as Libya. Mizraim or Misr, which is in Arabic, this is another African tribe. They had settled in the northeastern part of the continent. And then you have Cush. Cush is from Nubia, where Sudan is today. And that goes into Ethiopia, that goes into Eritrea, Djibouti, Somalia, etc. Now that area will be called Ethiopia. But Cush is the proper name. And also you look at Canaan. And Canaan is Palestine, parts of Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. So what you find, you've got black people or dark-skinned people living not just inside Africa, but just outside of the African continent itself, some parts in the Middle East. And what a lot of people try to deny, that a lot of the Cushitic groups not only lived on the eastern coast and by the Red Sea area, a lot of the Cushitic people lived in the southern western part of Arabia. Okay, this is where you're going to get the likes of Bilqis or Makeda or the Queen of Sheba coming out of this progeny here. And obviously you've got Iraq, which the Greeks called Mesopotamia. You've got another Cushitic group, and these are the ancient Sumerians. Okay, this is the ancient Sumerian society. And we know this because we know Nimrod, who is the son, okay, who's the son of Cush, okay, which is the grandson of Noah, say for instance. One of the things you notice, he was the first king on the earth. And in the Hebrew tradition, in the Christian tradition, and as he's in the Islamic tradition, this has been authenticated. He's the first king to rule. Now, he was the one which built the Tower of Babel, okay, or Babel, which means to confuse. And this is part of the ancient Cushitic Empire, the ancient Cushitic realm. Okay, so we have a presence of dark-skinned people not living just inside of Africa, in most parts of what we now call Arabia, but also in places like Mesopotamia, which they now situate in the so-called Middle East. So what we're trying to show here, we're looking at the racial composition in antiquity. So here it says, in several instances in the Bible, however, Cush seems to refer to a location not in Africa. So not in Africa, we're talking about Mesopotamia or ancient Iraq. We're talking about the ancient Sumerian civilization. So when you see Cush written in the Bible or Ethiopia, it doesn't necessarily mean it's Cush in Ethiopia in Africa. It can be Cush or what they refer to as Ethiopia, which is in what they refer to as Mesopotamia, or what is now today known as Iraq. So here you got the other map here. So you can see where some of those descendants in pink or purple, well, I should say, settled all around Africa, some parts of Canaan. You can see Canaan here, okay? And then you have the other children where you get Indo-Europeans, obviously the Japhetic people that went into the northern part of Asia, etc., you know, parts of Europe. And you got the Semitic groups, okay, around the Arabian Peninsula and some parts of the Levant or the Mediterranean. So this is what this picture actually shows, if you look at it from a religious perspective, because that's probably the oldest recordings of genealogies. So let's have a look at the Sumerian culture or civilization. Who are the people of Sumer and the Sumerians? While the Sumerians, while Sumerians or the Sumers, many cultural achievements are much celebrated, the important question of an ethnicity composition is frequently glossed over or left out of discussion altogether. So when you look at the Syriologists, say for instance, or the Sumeriologists and all these groups of people that dig up and look at Mesopotamia as a district or an ancient empire or a culture or a nation, whatever the case may be, whenever they look and try to look at the ethnicity or the racial composition of the people of Sumer, they don't know. And there's even arguments, they don't even know where the language comes from. But one thing that they're certain is not an Indo-European language, and it's not a Semitic language. So because it falls in the Hamitic language family, they don't want to acknowledge her. And that's what Runoko Rashidi is basically saying. Then if you look at Sumer and Kish, Kish is another word for Kush. Okay, these Sumerians are Ethiopians. So here you find they weren't just called Sumerians, they were also called Ethiopians. Ethiopians is a Greek word, which basically means burnt face or dark-faced people. So it doesn't mean the people of Ethiopia today. Ethiopia was the name they gave to people who came out of the African continent, and obviously in the Levant areas and also in Mesopotamia. So these Sumerians or Ethiopians, and they came to appear to have settled along tracks from Mesopotamia to India. This area now includes southern Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northwest India. So this is evidence that a lot of those dark-skinned populations obviously went and settled in those areas, which means they're the oldest people on the world or on the planet. These are the Hindu Kush mountains. So we got the word Kush again, okay? This is in Afghanistan and some parts of India. So you can find that the presence, when they left Africa, they kept their identity. The language would have changed somewhat, but they kept a lot of their identity. So this is something I think we need to recognize. So here, the oldest civilization of the reign was established by the Sumerians. They are designated in the Assyrio-Babylonian inscriptions as the blackheads or black-faced people. This is what they were called. This is what Sumer means. The word Sumer basically means blackheads or black-faced people. And this was written by John G. Jackson, who was an American historian. So if you look at the linguistic evidence now, okay, this was a book which was written by Martin Bennell, which is called Black Athena. It's a 3-volume book. And he was from a Jewish descent, an English historian of Jewish descent, he found out much later on in life, who decided to do a lot of study on his Jewishness, because he didn't know he was a Jew until a certain moment, within his life. And I think what is important here, he decided to put this book together because what he started noticing was that when he was studying Greek and Roman tradition or empire or culture, he started to notice that there was a close affiliation with an African root. This is what he started noticing, especially Greco-Roman culture. So if you look at the map here, you can see where I talked about the sons of Ham, Sham, and Japheth, and we looked at the African tribes that came out of Ham. So this is how this composition works. So you've got the Central Cushitic groups, Eastern Cushitic, okay, Southern Cushitic, okay? But when you look at the Sumerian, when you look at the Semitic groups come out of Africa into the Arabian Peninsula. So what this actually shows is the Semitic groups are in East Africa. And we know this because if we look at some of the Ethiopic or the Ethiopian traditions, for instance, they speak Amharic and Amharic. These are Semitic language. They usually refer to them as Afro-Semitic languages. So this is linguistic evidence to show you a similar migration and influence of language of African peoples outside of Africa. This would be considered the out of Africa aspect. So here, when we're looking at the Semitic groups, they would be known as Afro-Semitics, Africans who speak a Semitic language. And then here, you can see, this is the Egyptians, these are the Berbers, who come from the same roots, but they migrated different areas. Okay, these are talking about your black Berbers, not the white-skinned Berbers that live in North Africa today. The light-skinned Berbers that live in North Africa today are later newcomers, okay, latecomers, or interlopers. Many of them come from the Germanic tribes when the Romans was in Africa for a particular period of time, and they were ran out of Western Europe by the Germanic tribes. Those Germanic tribes came down and settled in places like Africa, the Iberian Peninsula, etc. The word Berber is considered to be related strongly to barbarian. This is a Roman terminology, so it has a negative connotation to a large extent. But when we talk about the Berber, we're talking about the indigenous North Africans. And obviously, we've got the Chaldaic groups of people, which are closely related with the Saharan Africans or the West Africans. I don't like to use the term sub-Saharan, because sub comes from a negative term, which basically means subordinate or meaning less than, just like what they call the Indian subcontinent. These words were constructed during colonization and colonialism, so they have negative connotations within its usage. So this is the linguistic evidence, okay, of migrations. Here's the physical evidence of migrations of people. So here you can see that out of Africa, migrations from out of Egypt, say for instance, into Canaan, which is like Syria, parts of Jordan, Lebanon and Syria, etc. You got the Sumerian civilization here, the Sumerian era there, which is Iraq. You got the Arabian Peninsula here. Some of them had settled, Afro-Semitic groups had settled, basically in the southern western area of Arabia. So this shows you the diffusion. Diffusion basically means where people migrate or people move. So this is talking about Semitic groups of people, yeah, moving out of Africa into the Arabian Peninsula and taking a language with them as well. Then let's have a look at the genetic evidence. So here is Alice Roberts. She's a scientist, and she wrote this book, I think it's probably about 10 to 12 years ago, called The Incredible Human Journey, which looks at the DNA and the genetic footprints of who we are, where we came from, etc. So what is important here to look at is this image here. This is the oldest person, individual, which is a female, called Luisa, okay, which is found in Brazil. Her skull is found in Brazil. She probably dates back between 10,000 to 20,000 years old. This is the dating of this. So we know who the original Americans were before the Mongoloid people or the Oriental, the Chinese, Japanese looking people came in, because there were three major waves that came into the Americas, okay? And that was about the second or the third wave when the Mongolian people with the ice caps and the ice bridge had went over to the Americas, Alaska, etc. So this actually shows who the oldest or the original people of America are. And then here you got the genetic footprint, which is very similar again. So I showed you the linguistic evidence. I've shown you the physical evidence, the anthropological evidence. This is now the genetic evidence. And it all points to the same roots out of Africa, okay? So this is how, some of them took a southerly route here. And if you notice here, this was before there was a gap in the Red Sea. So people would have crossed over this land bridge. This is how this would have came. This is how this would have came. So the thing about this is that it's important for us to look at ancient times. So we've looked at the linguistic evidence, we've looked at the anthropological evidence, we've looked at, you know, the physical evidence. Now this is a genetic evidence, and they all point to the same thing of the out of Africa theory, which we can now say it's a fact. So when we look at genetic evidence, how does that come about? Because everyone is quite fascinated with genetics, etc. So how it came about, in the late 80s, Rebecca Cannon and a team of Hawaii and Berkeley University, they collaborated together on this. And they were going to check out mitochondrial DNA. Now, mitochondrial DNA is DNA, which is found within females. It's passed from mother to daughter. It's also passed on from mother to son, but the only people who can pass it on is from female to female. Once it's passed on to a male, it cannot be passed on. So what they decided, they decided to test 147 different females of different races and ethnic groups, tribes and clans, etc. Okay, and what they were doing, they were extracting the DNA from the placentas, And then what they started noticing that all of those females from those different colors, races, ethnic groups, etc., all were related to one woman that lived in Africa, especially East Africa, approximately 190 to 200,000 years ago. So we all come from one. So we are actually, there's only one race, which is a human race, and there's only one family, and that's the human family. We're only split up through maybe elements of skin color, blood ties, ethnicities, racial classifications. They're more socially constructed much later on. So we're all related to one another. So it is one human family. And this was an article which was in Newsweek on the left-hand side, which was reporting this genetic finding, okay, that we all came out of Africa. So the search for Adam and Eve, okay, and these are the two people. Obviously, the people wouldn't have had Jerry kills back in those days, etc. But the fact of the matter is, they're showing you that the oldest people were dark-skinned people, which is DNA or mitochondrial Eve, as they call her. Okay, so that's one aspect, etc. And Y chromosomal Adam. So they're nomenclators. So they're names that they use that people are aware of to put onto the DNA markers or the genetic markers. So let's have a look at how we ended up moving around the earth. So here, what you'll find, these are the oldest genetic markers, L1, L2, L3. Okay, so these are mutations of Africans within the African continent. So they all start off in East Africa, and then one group known as L1 moves to the southern part of Africa. And they are close to the Khoisan people, or the Kon people of southern Africa. They're the people who Nelson Mandela is related to. Then you've got L2, which is the next mutation. They move to West Africa, Central to West Africa. And then L3, they seem to have stayed primarily in East Africa. So you're talking about Egypt and Sudan, you're talking about Eritrea, parts of Djibouti, Somalia, Kenya, Ethiopia. And then what happens is she has daughters known as M and N. Some M and Ns mutate, and they start to intensify that genetic mutation within the African continent, and then they start to move out. And then they actually become the peopling of the world, you know, much later on. However, one needs to understand, you can see the genetic links of whole humankind. So irrespective of skin color, phenotype, genotype, whatever the case may be, we all come from one another. So that's just a closer picture looking at, these are just some of the early genetic markers. Okay, these are the early genetic markers or the early mutations that take place. So this is what she's supposed to have looked like, mitochondrial Eve. She gives birth to L1, the San people. That's what they look like. Then the Mbuti people of the Congo, they're much shorter in stature, etc., slightly darker in skin. And then L3 is your Kikuyu people of Kenya. And from those people, you get the M and N. So you get other groups of people which come, and then you get those two M and N that migrate from within Africa, outside of Africa, into the Arabian Peninsula, and they go and people the rest of the world. So I'm just giving you some understanding of the genetic evidence seems to tally up with the linguistic evidence. It seems to tally up with the anthropological evidence and the archaeological or paleontological remains that they have dug up through excavations. So here, this is an important part, how races started to mutate. So what happened when all these Africans had moved out, okay, so when they started moving out in these directions here to people the rest of the world, what happened was there was a land bridge, which meant you were able to walk from one place to another. Okay, so there was a time called the Warminster. Africans were supposed to have left the continent of Africa. There was 2 or 3 different migrations. The most earliest migration they can think of when they settled in the Middle East was approximately between 134 and 136,000 years ago. The Australian people had migrated, okay, and ended up in Australia approximately 60,000 years ago, okay, over 60,000 years after that migration. So that's how long they've been living in Australia. But what happened was Africans were all over this place, all over the planet here. And then a massive ice age came, which was known as a warm interstadium. This is where ice caps in the northern part of the equator, which is approximately a mile thick, that lasted approximately 15 to 20,000 years. And if you want to find out any more about this, read the works of Nina Jablonski. Nina Jablonski actually talks about what takes place in the Ice Age when Africans were caught in this, because there's only one race of people if you want to look at it from that perspective. They were Africans. And when the ice came over, they started to slowly shed their melanin or their pigmentation. And there's a process which we went through albinism. So what happened was, because of the cold temperatures that was taking place, and they couldn't come back into the equatorial regions where things were much warmer, they were trapped there for between 15 to 20,000 years, and they started to lose their skin. So what scientists say, their hair started to become straight, because straight hair is more advantageous in colder weathers. They started to shed their skin color, and it became much paler, because lighter skin is more advantageous in colder weathers. Obviously, the hair needs to cover the neck and the ears and all the rest of stuff, because at that particular time, there was no shops. Okay, so they had to hunt for their clothes and whatever the case may be. So this is an important fact to make. So it took about approximately 15 to 20,000 years for Africans to become the color of what they now call Europeans. So they're a mutation. Okay, this is how this came about. And according to some of the scientists, white people or European people are approximately 20,000 years as a cluster group. As today's phenotypes are concerned, yeah, they're approximately maybe 20,000 years. So this is an important factor for us to think about. Okay, so what I'm going to do, we're going to have a slight little break at this moment in time. I'm going to open up for questions and answers, you know, elaborations, clarities, etc. And then we can go on to the second part. Let me just turn on the microphones. Participants. Why don't it unmute?
We can unmute ourselves.
You can you? Okay. Any questions at all?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
Please. I'm Hiba.
Okay.
I have a question concerning the first map you put. I think it was the first map.
The first.
I think the first one, where it shows the Cushitic and the Semitic and the Canaanites.
Okay, let me see if I can go back. This one?
Yeah, this one.
Okay, go on.
Can you explain why are the Cushitic people having the most influence, or like they are occupying the largest areas? Like they are occupying a large area in Africa, and then they spread into a part of Asia, while the Canaan are just occupying small place. So is it that they were stronger, more influential? What caused them to be like?
Yeah, it's a good question. From my understanding of history, the reason why the Cushitic groups of people were more numerous and much stronger was because they were the most advanced out of the 4 sons of Ham. They were the most advanced. They produced the first civilization, which was believed to be in Mesopotamia, which is Sumeria, etc. We know about King Namrud or Nimrod, etc., who was the first king. So the fact of the matter is, it looks like out of the 4 major groups or tribes, they were the most sophisticated and most advanced. And this is how they were able to occupy large areas of land in a short, well, it wouldn't be a short space of time. It would have taken, you know, thousands of years for this to take place. It wouldn't have happened overnight. It would have taken thousands of years to produce more children and obviously to migrate and to settle in other places. And that is one of the reasons why the Cushitics were the most influential people in antiquity. They created the first known civilization to man, which would be known as Sumerians. Now, there's a difference of opinion whether it is Egypt as a civilization older than Sumeria, or is it the other way around? It's an argument I don't know, really and truly. I'm more inclined to thinking that Sumeria is older. Okay, but there's a lot of evidence now coming out of Egypt saying that Egypt is far much older than Sumeria. So that's one of the reasons why the Cushitic bands or the Cushitic people ended up migrating, settling, and they ended up having large clusters of land under their domain. So I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Any other questions at all? Let's have a look at the chat, see if there's anything. No more questions? Okay. What we'll do, we'll have a little break here for about 5-10 minutes. Then we'll come back and we'll go into the second part, and we've been looking at ancient education amongst the ancient Sumerians, the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Nubians, and the Cushitic groups. Recording. Right, so we'll look at the next. So this is Alice Roberts's book here. I'm not sure if you've seen it back to front or upside down and the other way around, but that's the Incredible Human Journey. That's where I got most of my information from, okay, from this one. Okay, so that's where you'll find most of the information. And the other one, looking at genetic, the other one, which is a good book to read. This is simple for like newcomers. When I was teaching this at the university, for instance, this was a book I already taught. It simplified understanding DNA, migration, etc. It looked at language, yeah. It looked at all the different disciplines that came back to the same thing. Okay, this is Nicholas Wade's book, Before the Dawn. So that's another thing you can look at. That's where I got most of my information from. And then obviously the last one, looking at it from an archaeological and genetic perspective, is African Exodus, which is this one here, by Chris Stringer and Robert McKee. Okay, so these are 3 books which I've used for that information there. Okay, for the other information, looking at the physiology, or the physiology of who the ancient Egyptians were, etc. There's this book here, Egypt, the Child of Africa, by Ivan van Sertima. It's an edited edition. There's about 15 to 20 different authors that contribute to this science, yeah? The other one, which is really good as well for beginners, which I think you should get, would be, it's called African Presence in Early Europe. Okay, the African Presence in Early Europe. That's quite an easy read. And what the author does in that, he looks at the depigmentation. He looks at how Africans were caught up in the northern caps, and he talks about it from a scientific perspective on how they started to shed their melanin, because of the lack of vitamin D, because they had darker skin, and the ultraviolet rays of the light was very, very low in those temperatures, so they had to shed their skin. Really, really good. Charles Finch does a chapter on that, but that's another good book. And some of the other thing on the ancient Egyptians, this one here, Introduction to African Civilizations by John G. Jackson. Excellent book for beginners. And that's the last one. Yeah, the rest are for later. Right, let me just read some of this and I'll start the lesson. And, but no evidences. But no evidences. Okay. Abu, put on book list. Okay, Jacqueline. Okay, okay, Jacqueline. Please put it on book list. Okay, what I'll do, that's a good idea. I'll send that over, yeah? Because many of you probably didn't get it, etc. So what I'll do, I'll send all this over either on Twitter or Facebook, or I'll send it via email. That's not a problem. Okay, no problem at all. Thank you. Right, let's make a start. And this is the second part now, looking at education, Africans in education. Right, so now we've talked about the different migrations. We looked at the linguistic evidence, we look at the cultural evidence, we look at migratory evidence, we looked at 3 or 4 different types of evidences to show that it came back to the same path, the same beginnings, the same origin. Before those cultural diffusions took place, whether it was the diffusion was genetically or whether it was socially or whatever the case may be. So let's start off now. When Egypt comes into existence, Egypt comes into existence by Nama, or Menes, as the Greeks would call him. Nama was Cushitic. Okay, this is important. Nama was Cushitic, and he was the one that united, which united both lands. Okay, Nama was the one which united both lands of Upper and Lower Egypt. This is what he did, okay? He went in there with a mighty force of Africans, you know, and that's how we basically took over and united those 2 lands. So this is when there was cultural unity between Upper and Lower Egypt, or what the Egyptians called Kemet, because Egypt is a Greek term or the Greek word, okay? The ancient Egyptians call themselves Kemites. That's what they call themselves, or they call the country Kemet. They call themselves Kemetu, which means the black ones, the dark ones, the black people. This is what they call themselves. So this is important to know. So we're dealing with an African presence within an African country, which may not be African today from a physiological perspective or from a genetic or a physical perspective. But the reality is that it is an African country. Okay, it is an African country. It's not in the Middle East, as people like to say. Middle East was socially constructed during the Sykes and Picot Agreement of the turn of the 20th century. And that was after they colonized Africa, after the Berlin Conference in the 1880s. They then decided to devour the Ottoman Empire, and then they split up the Ottoman Empire between Britain and France. So for instance, Syria was part of the French Empire, Iraq was part of the British Empire, and so on and so forth. We know about Saudi Arabia, we became a kingdom, Bahrain, Qatar, you know, etc. This is what happens really and truly. So Naaman is the first king, not Pharaoh. Naaman is the first king to unite. He's not just a warrior, but he's also a leader, a political leader. And he unites Upper and Lower Egypt. Then, if we look here, one of the things that we notice is this is what the ancient Egyptians themselves say, known as the Papyrus of Hunefa. We came from the beginning of the Nile, where God happy dwell at the foothill of the mountain of the moon. They're basically saying they come from Kilimanjaro. So they would have come from the Cushitic branch again. This is what they are saying. Although Egyptologists would like to tell us other things, we should always go back to the primary sources. And the primary sources tell us that the ancient Egyptians acknowledge themselves as being dark-skinned people, black-skinned people. They recognized they were Africans. They had their own particular language. But Egypt became a pooling. So you had what made Egypt what it is. It was a pooling. They got a lot of their influences from outside of that nation. So for instance, if you look at mummification, for instance, the Egyptian mummies, the oldest mummies which have been found in Africa was actually found in Libya. So there must have been people who migrated from the country of Libya, what we see in Libya today, because there was no borders back in those days. This is what is really important. There was no borders back in those days. Sudan and Egypt was one country, as to speak, made up of amalgamation of different tribes and clans and whatever the case may be. The Africa you see today, if you look at Africa as a continent, if you know, you'll notice something. There's straight lines on majority of the countries. These were lines which were drawn at the Berlin Conference in the 1880s, 1884 to 1885. Okay, this is what is really important for us to know. So we must look at the map, how it looked back then, as opposed to what it looks like now. So what they're saying, they came from Kilimanjaro, you know, they came from Kenya. This is what they say, okay? So this is important for us to acknowledge and for us to recognize. So let's move on. So there you can see Lower Egypt is up in the north, not in the south, up in the north, okay? Upper Egypt is in the south because they always look to the south, okay? They always look to the south because that's where the people originally came from. And I showed you the migrations earlier. If you look at the linguistic evidence I showed you with Egypt, yeah, the Berbers and the Chaldaic people going into West Africa, that's where they began. So I've shown you linguistic evidence, anthropological evidence, genetic evidence, which tells us the same thing. So what is important here is that Upper Egypt is where the major power is. This is where the major power is. And obviously, this is where most of the majority of the things were happening. When many of the invaders came in, it was mainly in the northern parts which they occupied, not in the southern parts. It's the northern parts they had occupied. So this is important for us to understand really and truly. We must look at it as it was back then. So you got Lower Egypt at the top, Upper Egypt, you know, at the bottom. They always look to the south. Now, when the Aswan Dam was being created in the early 1960s, a lot of archaeologists were going down because there was going to be a lot of disaster and ruins with the flooding of this particular area. People were going to lose their homes. They had to move some of the monuments onto higher ground or higher levels, etc. So you had all these different paleontologists, Egyptologists, anthropologists going down there to find out what they can find. And what happened was many of them started leaving because they weren't finding of anything of significance. And they were just ready to leave. And an American team found a discovery in a place called Kustal, okay, in the place called Kustal, which is mainly in the Sudan area, which is probably because of the Sudan area now. What you'll find, they found 22 tombs. They actually found the hieroglyphics at its earliest. They actually saw incense burners, etc., which was approximately 300 to 600 years before Menes had united the two countries. So there was civilization. So the hieroglyphics or the Medu-Neter that the ancient Egyptians used was found amongst the Cushitic people, which would be in what is now known as Sudan, because that's where Kush is. Kush is part of Sudan and Ethiopia and all these other places. That's where most of the Cushitic tribes that were. And you can see where Kush is there. Okay, so it's right next door. There was no lines bordering people. You know, people can walk from, say, northern Sudan into Upper Egypt, you know, quite easy. There was no borders there at all. All these borders were something that came in the 1880s. So here is where we're looking at education. There's King Zosa of the 3rd dynasty. If my memory serves me right, he was the 2nd leader, and he commissioned this multi-genius by the name of Imhotep, okay? Imhotep, he comes in peace. This is what it means, he comes in peace. This Africa was a multi-genius, okay? He was an advisor to King Zosa, who was on the left-hand side of the screen. You can see the nose has been broken up, but you can still see his African features. He came from Upper Egypt, okay? This is where the ruling clans really came from Upper Egypt. That's where the power was. So Imhotep, the multi-genius, he was a prime minister, he was an advisor, a vizier, he was an advisor, but he was also a mathematician, he was also a lawyer, okay? He was a multidisciplinary individual, and he is regarded historically as the first multi-genius, a multidisciplinary expert in history. He's the oldest recorded person, this person by the name of Imhotep. So this is something we need to understand about education. So by that time, when he created what was known as the, if I can get it up, the step pyramid, okay? That was the pyramid that he created for Zosa, King Zosa, before he created the other pyramids within the African continent. Okay, so you find that if you were looking at it, elements of geometry, trigonometry would have been used. Pi would have been used. So mathematics was at its height. It was very, very sophisticated at this time. And we're talking approximately when? If you go back, we're talking approximately when? 2000, okay, 686. Yeah, okay, so we're talking over 5,000 years ago. 6,000 years ago, this would have happened. So they would have had a calendar. They would have had 24 hours in a day, okay, 7 days in the week. They would have made these calculations because they had observatories. They would be looking in the stars to understand the planetary systems so they can regulate their behavior and pattern according to the sun, according to the moon, when they can do business, etc. This is what's important about ancient civilization. So observatories and calculations would have been established at its most earliest stages. And it takes thousands of years to calculate, to observe the stars, etc., to know the rotation of how long it takes this particular planet to go around this planet or whatever the case may be. It takes thousands of years. It's passed on from one generation to another. So this is important thing for us to acknowledge and understand, okay? Out of the 30 dynasties or kingdoms, it was during the first 7 dynasties that most of the pyramids were built. And this is an important factor here because we hear sometimes, you know, mistakenly in films and things like that, that when the children of Israel, for instance, or the Hebrew people were in Egypt, the slaves, they were building pyramids. The pyramids, no pyramids were built. No pyramids in Egypt were built after the 12th dynasty. After the 12th dynasty, there was no more pyramids built. So the fact of the matter is they come round about the 19th dynasty. They must have been building temples. It wouldn't have been pyramids, okay? And this is the thing. This is what the ancient Egyptians themselves say, because they moved into temple building now. There was a lot of pyramids being built in Nubia, which is northern Sudan today, yeah. But the Egyptian had moved on to temple building. So this is important for us to acknowledge and keeping things in chronological order. This is the mummy, or supposed to be the mummy, of Imhotep himself. Okay, you can see that the man has dark skin and his lips may be thin, but he has a projection of the mouth, okay, the high cheekbones, the bald head, because a lot of them would have shaved themselves at that time. It was a thing of hygiene. It was a thing that many of the priests or people of stature would have done, especially amongst the males. So these are important things for us to acknowledge. The mummy of Imhotep, while the population of Kemet, because that's what the Egyptians called themselves, Kemet, was somewhat mixed ethnically, because people would have come back in, and racially. Even in the early kingdoms, it was the southern Black Africans, in other words, in Upper Egypt, okay, yeah, who took the leadership, founded Kemet, and governed it during the Golden Age. Okay, so we're talking about the Golden Age, we're talking about the early dynastic period. The early dynastic period, you know, before the time of the Hebrew people coming in around about the 19th dynasty, okay? That was when they had their golden age. And then we started to see elements of decline because there was different invasions coming in. So the first invasion that came into Africa as a force was the Hyksos or the Shepherd Kings. That was approximately 1650 BC. They only lasted for maybe 3 dynasties. If my memory serves me right, the dynasty 14, 15, and 16. Then the southern kings in Upper Egypt kicked them out. Hamus Nefertari was one of the main things. A female was one of the one who was instrumental in orchestrating the power of the Kemetic people in Upper Egypt to come back, because they had disturbed particular things. And they believed that it was through the Hyksos invasion why no more pyramids were built in Egypt. This is about 1650. And then obviously the Africans take over power again. And then later on, there was other invasions which came in. So you had the Assyrians that came in around about 662, 663. Then the Persians came in around about 525 BC. Alexander of Macedonia comes in around about 332 BC. Then the Romans come in 30 BC. So now you start to see the Greco-Roman period come in when Egypt is at its decline. They come in much later now. So even though it's a pharaonic dynasty, they're not the indigenous people of the African continent who are rulers now. You have interlopers, you have latecomers, newcomers who are now becoming pharaohs. So when you look at the time of Cleopatra, this is the Greek period. So when Alexander comes in 332 BC, he dies approximately, I think, about 10 years later, etc. Ptolemy, one of his generals, begins the pharaonic dynasty, sometimes called the Ptolemy or the Ptolemy dynasty. She comes out of that. And I'm not sure if she's Cleopatra the 7th or Cleopatra the 8th. So she is from a mixed progeny. She would have had African elements in her, but she would have come from, that was the Greek period, but they were still pharaonic. They didn't Hellenize the African continent. Yeah, they took on African attire or Egyptian attire, as they would call it, or Kemetic attire. Yeah, they used the legal system of ancient Kemet, the writing system of ancient Kemet. Okay, and this is important for us to know. So this is just showing you who Imhotep was, and this is supposed to be an image of him as a mummy. Then we get the later dynasty, which is known as the Cushitic dynasty, who take over Egypt around about 700 BC. And that was by Shabaka and then Pianke. This is the likes of Taharqa. Taharqa is mentioned in the Bible in Kings, okay, who went in to help Hezekiah, yeah, maintain power when the Assyrians were coming in. Okay, this is important for us to know. And this is known as the 25th dynasty. Okay, the 25th dynasty. So it was during this 25th dynasty that there was a restoration of ancient ways. Okay, because at that time, because of the different invasions that came in, what you start to find was that the Kemetic people forgot their religious ceremonies. They forgot the spiritual understandings. The Cushitic people knew it. So it's clear there was a close affinity and relationship between them as far as education was concerned. And the Nubians, or the Cushitic people as they were called, or the Nubian Kush, were very, very serious about education at this time. They had university complexes themselves. So here you can see the Cushitic Empire. The heart of the Cushitic Empire is more into the Sudan, going into Ethiopia, etc. But this was all their realm. Now, the thing about Taharqa, the King Taharqa, or Pharaoh Taharqa, was that he actually controlled most of North Africa as well, because inscriptions have been found in the Spanish records. He's known as Taroko, or Toroko. And it's the same Taharqa, which is there. So North Africa is part of that realm. So the Cushitic Empire, or the 25th Dynasty Empire, encompassed most of North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula. But that is not found in this. So there's another historical distortion where this is concerned. But you can see how the Mediterranean people now are being touched by this, and they're now coming to write scripts. The first script amongst the Europeans was basically the Greeks, between 600 to 700 BC. That's the earliest script in Europe. And it was the Phoenicians that taught them the script. And I'll show you who the Phoenicians were later on, who were the Canaanites. That's who the Phoenicians are, were Canaanites. Okay, so this is the temple complex of Ipet Isut. Okay, this was built around about the 11th dynasty. So this is approximately about 2000 BC. So the African continent had university complexes. This is important for us to know, university complexes. Okay, this housed approximately 80,000 students. There was no Greece, there was no Rome. Okay, there was no Hittites, there was none of these empires at all. They were still in their infancy of culture. They weren't even civilized yet. They didn't have a high culture yet. The first of the high cultures comes from the Greeks. So what I'm emphasizing here is looking at the educational system. priests were scientists and scientists were priests. There was no division between science and religion. That only happened between church and state and etc. within the European or the Western world, because they didn't see, they saw what was known as the principle of polarities of being something that come together. This is what they saw, things come together. We know things by their opposites. And this is the tradition in African culture. This is why Africa as a continent is called what? It's called the motherland. It's not called the father's land, it's called the motherland. It's feminine. Okay, and you're going to understand that it was a matrilineal, matriarchal society. You can only be a pharaoh, yeah, if your mother came from the royal family. And it was the same amongst the Nubians. They were known as Kentuckes. And I'll talk about them next week, the Kentuckes. And there were some powerful queens who took on the likes of Augustus Caesar. They took on the likes of Alexander the Great, known as Queen Candace. She defeated Alexander the Great. You know, the other one defeated Augustus Caesar. And I will talk about these powerful women. They were leaders. They were priestesses, okay? And they had massive realms and empires. And another one who comes out of the Cushitic branch was Makeda Bilqis, or the Queen of Sheba, another powerful queen. So you will find, if you look at things from a historical perspective, women in the African continent were allowed to be educated, and they were allowed to entertain themselves in the political and the legal system, especially the political system as leaders. We know about the likes of Hatshepsut and Queen T. We talk about Nefertari and Nefertari. They didn't have the power that the likes of Hatshepsut and Queen T had. However, they were powerful queens. Children began their education after the age of 7. And I know in most parts in Northern Europe, we know that children don't start work until 7. Because in ancient Kemetic tradition understanding, there were three phases within child development. The first 7 years, a child should play. This is what they believed. And funny, I'm not sure if it's Sweden or Norway or Denmark, one of those countries adopted this Kemetic tradition. The children don't start school until 7. So what the ancient Kemetic said, between 0 to 7, a child should be engaged in play. That way they become skillful people, skillful individuals. They learn right from wrong. They will learn from their mistakes. They must play. This was the first thing. And from 8 to 14, that's when they go into the education, the early years of education, from the age of 8 to 14. And from 15 to 21, then that's when you find the element of maturity. There are 3 stages. And if you study developmental psychology now, what has come out in developmental psychology in the last maybe 10 to 15 years is these type of principles. So the ancient Kemites and the ancient Nubians, when they dealt with education, they knew they were onto something. They knew that children don't have to be educated as early as 4 and 5 and all these other things. Allow them to play, get the serious education started by the time they're 7. That way they're able to sit there, you know, for longer periods of time and absorbing, because all the play is out of them throughout those years. This is important for us to understand. And teachers within the Western world find it very, very difficult when children will not sit down. Thank you. Someone said it was Finland. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for that. So this is an ancient tradition. Children's education should really start at 7. That doesn't mean there's no harm in getting them to be educated, but don't intensify the instruction or the education until when? Until the age of 7 onwards. And like I said here, women also were educated and headed faculties. This has only been recent in the last 20, 30 years in the Western world. And when I mean the West, when I talk about the most advanced Western worlds, such as America and the UK. So they allowed females to be educated. There was this belief amongst ancient Kemetic people that the first teacher to a child is the mother with breastfeeding, because she opens up the sensory motor skills of the child. So when the child is breastfeeding, all 5 senses are switched on simultaneously. Smell, you can smell the mother. It recognizes the scent. Touch, skin to skin. Okay, hearing, you can hear the heartbeat, you can also hear the mother. And this is really important for us. After a certain age, the child can see the mother. So it switches on all senses simultaneously. And what Western scientists or Western developmental psychology are beginning to realize, breastfeeding is not just the fact of feeding. There's this bonding mechanism that is taking place. And there's this element of concentration where the child becomes relaxed around that type because all senses are being stimulated simultaneously. The ancient Kemites knew about this. The ancient Nubians knew about this. This is something that most Western scholars are now beginning to realize now. And now they find that women are now being encouraged to breastfeed and whatever the case may be, because it's more to do with not just the feeding of a child, it's more to do with the socialization, the bonding mechanisms, the attachment elements in child development. Because education is not about test scores, it's about developing the individual. This is what the ancient Kemites truly believed. It's about educating the individual who can do good for his or her community. This concept of educating yourself for a job is only recent. And that only came out of the enslavement period and when capitalism, came out of that, where there was a lot of emphasis on making money. So what you find now within the Western world, as far as education is concerned, there's a lot of emphasis on, I'm going to school to get myself a job. I'm going to college to get myself a job. I'm going to university so I can get myself a job. But where's the development in there? This is what is important. And this is what made education very serious amongst the ancient Africans at this time. It was about developing the individual, not for them to get a job, for them to harmonize and to benefit their community and to help their community develop into something sophisticated by the amount of knowledge that he or she was able to consume. And in the University of Ipet Isut, these were the courses that they were teaching. They were teaching languages. You had to speak the language of the commoner, the language of the royals. You had to speak all these different languages. When you looked at Cleopatra, she spoke about 6 to 7 languages. And you'll find if you go to the African continent today, no matter if you're north, south, east, or west, one of the things that you'll realize as well is that the language system, over there, the average, I think the minimum language that they speak in Africa is 3. So so 3 is a minimum. And most of them are quite confident and competent in not just speaking local dialects or the main languages, they're also competent in at least one European language. This is the African continent. So this has been an old tradition, for thousands of years. And even though it's been disturbed through the transatlantic slave trade, it's been disturbed through Western imperialism and colonization, those cultural elements are still in place. This is what is important here. It's still in place. They were able to maybe destroy the people, take their resources, minerals, and commodities, but not so much their minds. As Steve Biko once said, before the South African apartheid government had killed him and bashed his brains out, one was the thing that he said, of calling people to power. He said the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the minds of the oppressed. This is what they want. So you've got to control your mind. So it is important for us as human beings to ensure that when we're educating ourselves, we have as less distractions as possible. We have to read more. Like I said in the conference with Akala, etc., one of the things which I said, that a child should be reading a minimum of 1 hour a day. 1 hour a day. That's equivalent to 30 hours a week. Most children watch more TV, more than 30 hours a week in television, than reading. And we wonder why there's literacy problems within the educational system, okay? We have to be serious with our children's education from the time of 7 onwards. This is really important. This is a time for them to settle down and they should be taking information. We should not sit them down and to intensify it to the point that they've got to do this. No, we ease them into it. Education is like a plate of food. And what I mean by a plate of food, we take little bits. There's a large amount on the plate, but we take little bits at particular intervals. Education should be the same when we're sitting down children. So many parents are puritanical towards their children. They want them to be doctors and they want them to be engineers and they want them to be scientists at a very early age. They've literally mapped out their children's life for them. And the intensity. And as a school counselor, speaking to these children, etc. They get engaged in suicidal thoughts. They have suicidal tendencies. You know, the work is too hard. Usually when the parents are demanding this, they're never really there to help them with the instruction. This is what you will find. They expect other institutions to do it. But when it comes time for them to do the homework, etc., they got to do it themselves. So parents are not even assisting their children, but they got these great demands on their children at a very early age. We have to be realistic as far as education is concerned. And the ancient Kemetic people, the ancient Cushitic people were aware of this. This is why children within these societies are considered gems. They are considered gems. They're a replica, yeah, of who we are as human beings, as a mother or father. It's still seen like that within many of these African countries. So even though imperialism and colonization and exploitation has taken over that continent, those traditional values are still there. They're still in place. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the systems which was taught at this university. Like I said, education started at the age of 7. By the age of 8, it was the intermediary stage. And then obviously from 21 onwards was the serious study. From 21 onwards was the serious study. Okay, so people will go into college/universities in Africa from 21 onwards. Not like now at 18 and 17 because they're gifted and things like that. They still have to grow. They still have to develop. Okay, they still have to fulfill their role as they develop through the age. So it says here that Ipet Isut was like all other lesser temples in Kemit's Nile Valley. Every temple had a faculty and a library. Do we have that within our homes? Okay, this is important for us. Do we have these in our homes? So reading and writing was really important. Reading and writing was really important. And having particular departments was really important. So these were the sort of things which we were teaching, which is known as the mystery system. Okay, this is what they call it, the mystery system. So the mystery teacher of the heavens. So the people who taught the heavens, they taught astrology and astronomy. This is what was taught at the University of Ipet Isut. Mystery teachers of the land, they taught geography, okay? Space. This is what they taught. They taught geography, which is looking at space in the physical realm where we're walking on. Then you have the mystery teachers of the depth, which is geology, and the mystery teachers of the secret world, which is philosophy and theology. So this is what was really important for them. They wanted people, and you had to master one to go on to another. It's not like what it is today, where somebody wants to be a scientist, so they study astronomy and finished. No, it wasn't like that in the university. You had to go through all these different levels, but you had to specialize in at least one. But you had to have knowledge in all of those things. And this comes out of what I talked about of Imhotep, who was a multi-genius. He was a political scientist in the way. He was a theologist. Yeah, he dealt with, he was a philosopher. He was a prime minister, okay? He was also an architect and engineer. This is what the society was trying to create in people, to benefit their society, not to look for jobs, not to look for work. I'm not saying that work shouldn't be associated with the educational system, but within the Western world, unfortunately, that's how it is seen now. This is not traditional understanding with African education. And then what comes out of these traditions is obviously mathematics and philosophy. But the thing I want to point your attention to, there was two polarities, or there was polarities that were involved in the makeup of education in an instruction. Qualitative information, dealing with figurative information, quantitative, and qualitative, looking at written information. This is what came out of it. And you had to master two of these. So education was really serious, very, very serious. So here is another part of Ipet Isut. It was both a center of religion and education, since the two could not be separated in the minds of the ancient Kemats. So religion and education was intertwined with one another. It wasn't the separation of church and state. And that is what makes, this is why you find that when people come from the African continent, they're very, very strong in their religion, whether they're Muslims, whether they're Christian, whether they're Jews, as well. They don't see no difference. They actually see it enhances them religiously and spiritually by studying science, engineering, whatever the case may be. They don't see it different. Okay, and this is important for us to know. So this ancient tradition that has lasted for over 6,000 years is still with the people even till today when they come into the Western academies within this country. It housed an elite faculty of priest professors. So the priest was a scientist was a priest. You had to master both. And I'm going to explain why this is important. It's been estimated that at one time there was more than 80,000 students that was attending this university complex in Ipet Isut, which is situated in Luxor today. So what I'm saying here is that this educational system was advanced and they were tutored in a way in which they were able to comprehend and master the sciences. Education was really, really serious at this moment in time. So, but 80,000 students, these 80,000 students came as far as South Africa, as far as the Congo, as far as North Africa. This is what they didn't all come from within Egypt, and there were students from all over the place. So there was different languages which had to be spoken and had to be translated, etc. But anyone could learn at these universities, and they were not exclusive to anyone. Okay, it was inclusive. Okay, very inclusive. Anyone can go to these, provided that you had a well-grounded education, so you can complete your studies. This is what it was about, and it was open to anybody to come there. This is why we know as early as this, as early as the 6th century, as early as the 600s, we started to see during the 25th dynasty, we started to see a massive amount of Greeks going into Africa and learning at the foot of Africans. This is where the philosophy came from. Greek philosophy, you find, has its roots in ancient Kemet or ancient Egypt. And this is a fact. But there was a spiritual and religious significance to that. Not everything is logical. And this is what is important here. They had to look beyond that, because this is why when you study the stars and the planetary systems, etc., not everything is logical in the sense. You have to get a greater understanding. What is the wisdom? This is what they call the mystery system. The mystery system is called wisdom. You had to look beyond the knowledge to get a greater understanding of the information that you had in order for you to conduct yourself in a particular manner. So here is where the polarities come into play. So here you got Tehuti and Ma'at. These are polarities when you're dealing with education. So Tehuti is a masculine wisdom principle of God, and Mahat was the female principle of God and represented what? The female principle represented truth, justice, and righteousness. This is what it was about. And Tehuti, which is the masculine aspect, because they didn't divide the two, Upper and Lower Egypt, male and female, boy and girl, up and right. The ancient Kemites, the ancient Nubians, the ancient Kushites, they knew that the polarities come together. We know things by their opposite. By removing one, the other one can't function and exist. This is how they understood education to be. So when we look at Tehuti, for instance, their masculine energy focused on writing and learning. This is more to do with the cognitive development of the individual, whether male or female. But Mahat is important here. Why is a feminine principle truth, justice, and righteousness? Because those particular subjects would now become a discipline. They call it discipline. The word discipline means that that subject disciplines you in life. In other words, you conduct yourself in a particular manner. That's what the feminine principle of education meant. This is why if you look that these subjects within schools and colleges are known as subjects, okay? Not disciplines. Why? Because it doesn't ground people in good conduct and good behavior. Classroom management is within the disciplines, within the subject areas, not an additional thing outside. Children learn through the disciplines how to behave. And this is what is important here for us to understand. Okay, so one looked at the psychological perspective of education and how it developed an individual. And the Ma'at principle is about truth, justice, and righteousness. And this is why, if you look at what's taking place in the world today, let's give an example. We have Oxford and Cambridge, we have Yale, Berkeley, we have Harvard, we have all these top universities in the Western world. But yet, when you look at the amount of embezzlement and fraud that's taking place, what they call white-collar crime, these are the individuals, mainly males, they come out of these type of universities, these type of institutions. Why? Because they were not taught disciplines. The subjects were not disciplined in them. They're ripping off people, and then they're being bailed out by the government. They're, you know, they're having these massive loans, or they're having these massive bonuses and all these other types. This is corruption. And this is what I mean. Education is supposed to ground people so they behave appropriately in the labor market. This is what it is about. This is what the ancients understood. And this is what is literally lost somewhat within the educational system in the West. So we must go back to the principles of Ma'at and Tahuti. So if we ask teachers, as an example, we have to make sure that instructions encompasses the cognitive development, as well as the mental development, as well as the emotional development. And once they're able to do that, they can now act. Their behavior, their conduct will harvest a discipline. This is what it's about. So education is about disciplining the individual. The classroom management aspect is within the subject area, not something outside to correct the child. The child is taught within the subjects. And this is how it was done in ancient times, which is unfortunately lost in the modern world. So what happened is, round about the time of the Greeks, remember, like I said earlier, the Greeks came in when? The Greeks came in under with Alexander, round about 332 BC. Okay, they came in, they took over ancient Kemet, and what started happening then, you have foreign rulers who were pharaohs now. Foreign rulers who were pharaohs. And then obviously we know about the university, or the Library of Alexandria. Okay, which Alexander was going to build, but it was Ptolemy decided to take over because Alexander died before his time. And what they started to study, they learned the ancient Kemetic language, they learned how to read hieroglyphics, and what they focused on, the Greeks, because obviously libraries were already there. There was a lot of scripts, you know, and scribes and tablets, etc., of all types of information within Africa. And they focused on grammar, rhetoric. So grammar, how one speaks, etc. Rhetoric is really low, okay? But we would use it where rhetoric is considered a negative way in expressing oneself. And the other things they focused on was logic. They were the three things that the Greeks focused on when they were in Africa under the Ptolemy dynasty. And that was then brought back into Greece during Hellenization. The re-Hellenization, in a sense. So what happened in what was taking place in Greek, Hellenization was coming to, not so much to an end, but was attenuating or reducing. And they were now introducing ancient Kemetic, ancient Nubian philosophical approaches to education. And then in Rome, because Rome comes into Africa when? We know Rome comes into Africa at 146 BC into North Africa when they defeated the Carthaginians in the Third Punic Wars. However, they were at the gates of Egypt during the time of Cleopatra, and then they ended up taking over Egypt in 30 BC after the death of Cleopatra. And this is what they focused on when they became pharaohs. Okay, so this is the Greco-Roman period now, who've taken over this particular part of Africa, and they are using African disciplines and sciences because that's where the libraries were. There was no libraries in Europe at this time, and this is important for us to acknowledge. So the reality is that arithmetic, astronomy, geometry, and music is what they focused on. So when the Greco-Roman culture comes and synthesizes this together, this is when you get what is known as the 7 liberal arts. This is how it comes. So the roots of education within itself comes out of the continent of Africa. Okay, not by one particular race or group. They collaborated together, people as far as Southern Africa, people as far as the Congo, coming in to Egypt, bringing in their different understandings, their different sciences, etc., and making it a high culture. and then making sure that the commoners were able to access these university complexes or college complex or even education, because education was valued in that time in those regions by those people. Then we have the likes of Hatshepsut. So when we look at the likes of Hatshepsut, for instance, one of the things that we notice is that she was a pharaoh. Okay, she was a pharaoh. She won. They call her Queen Hatshepsut, but she had the beard underneath her. She was, you know, they used to accuse her for cross-dressing, but she wasn't cross-dressing. What she was doing, she was using the attire of a pharaoh. That's what she was doing. And then she made sure that some of her monuments that she actually had a beard stuck under her chin to say that I'm a pharaoh, I'm a ruler. This woman was a powerful woman. Hatshepsut, the most famous woman to rule Kemet of any other nation as a king. Very powerful woman, Hatshepsut, and we should read more about her. She was a well-educated woman, spoke approximately 7 languages, and she was educated she was actually educated earlier than the age of 7. And she was a favorite daughter of her father. And he wanted to cultivate into her leadership skills because he was very unhappy about the dynasty which was ruling, and he didn't really want to see his daughter exploited, so he gave her the best education that he can find. And by the time Thutmose came in, she ended up pushing him to one side, put him on his campaigns, etc., and she became the ultimate ruler in Kemet. And this is what this woman ruled. This is what this woman ruled. You can see how huge their empire is. You can see parts of Libya, Upper and Lower Egypt, parts of Kush, which is Nubia, right into the Sudan, most of, you know, the Red Sea area, etc. Obviously, you've got Punt there, which is Somaliland, Djibouti, etc. And when they do talk about this individual, they talk about when she went on an expedition to Punt. Now, Punt, which is in Somaliland, was the Mecca for the ancient Egyptians. Okay, so they were still religious and spiritual. They didn't see religiosity, spirituality, in opposition to secular sciences. They saw it all together as for the thing of discipline, of how to control yourself. That's what discipline is about. And this is what they call the subjects, obviously translated to English, is a discipline. So when we look at education and we're teaching children, whatever it is, we have to make sure we should not see it as a subject. We must see it as a discipline to regulate and moderate their behavior. This is what it's about. This is how we should see this when we're socializing our children. So let me carry on. Then we have another powerful woman, which is known as Queen T. I will deal with her a little bit more next week. I won't go too much into her today. But one thing I want to show you here about co-equals, the principles of polarity. I talked about Tehuti and Ma'at that comes together. This is a left and a right hemisphere. This is what this is about, the left and right hemisphere. And I'll talk about the cognitive development and how the left and right hemisphere should be understood by parents, by teachers, and by carers. What you find here, if you look at the image here up the top, you will see that they sat together. She's obviously her arms around her husband. He loved this woman a lot. But if you look at the top of his head there, you will notice that her headgear is slightly higher, okay? And you will not see this in any other of the monuments in ancient Egypt. And this actually shows not only sees as a co-equal, she is the power behind the throne. The word for chair or throne in ancient Kemetic language is called aset. Aset means a seat. This is where we get the translation, the Greek translation of Isis. That's a Greek translation. They didn't call it Isis. Okay, is a seat. Why? Because when a man takes the seat, who's the power behind the throne? Aset, the female principle. This is how it was understood. Education, the systems and the principles of polarities that came together was to create harmony, balance, reciprocity between the two forces, which was not opposing forces. They just had to find a balance between them. And this is what is important. Unfortunately, the polarities, the principle of polarities in the Western world is, well, the strong versus the weak, the male versus the female, okay? the rich versus the poor, and so on and so forth. No, polarities come together, which means one has more of a responsibility to maintain the other. So here I'm trying to show you the place that African women were. They were rulers. The most female rulers up till date now is the African continent. There is no country or no continent that has produced more more leaders who were females than the African continent. This is historical. So, and the other thing, it was a matriarchal system, not a patriarchal system like what was in Indo-European culture. It was matriarchal, which meant that lineage or the authority or the power came through the mother. This is how women were seen. This is why Africa is called the motherland. So what I'm trying to show you here is the power this woman had behind the throne. So here it is Queen T again. And this is what I want to emphasize here. She was educated as a young person. Now, Queen T is believed now. There's a person by the name of Ahmed Osman, who's an Egyptian Egyptologist, who believes that this woman, Queen T, is supposed to be the daughter of Joseph, which is written in the Bible. Joseph of the coat of many colors, or what the Arabs call Yusuf, alayhi salam. They said that this is his daughter. This is what he says. So, and she is going to be not just a capable ruler, she comes from strong lineage, but she was a commoner. This is what is important here. She was considered a commoner. So here it says she was a capable ruler. Why was she a capable ruler? Because she was educated by her father. Her father made sure that she was highly educated. She had a personal library, which consisted of books of religion, history, scientific texts, poetry, and stories. And one of the things I want to emphasize here about education in the ancient African world was that memorization was important. You had to go over information to memorize. It became part and parcel of who you were and who you are. Memorization. And this is what we do. This is why we make nursery rhymes, where it rhymes at the end. It's easy to memorize. This is the whole point of it. And it's through what? Repetition. Children have to learn through repetition. So we have to repeat ourselves. We should tell it, we should say it, tell them again, and reinforce it by doing it. And I'll explain the art of educational psychology in the later section, after we've had our break. She mastered most of its content. That's through memorization. She exerted political influence whereby her decisions were highly respected and executed. Kings from Persia would write to this woman. Kings from Mesopotamia would write to this woman. She was a power behind the throne. So what I'm trying to show you, that educating a woman is vitally important, as well as educating men. And this is what happened. This is what happened in the African societies. This is why African history and Black History Month is important. We must make sure we emphasize the roles that Black or African women had in antiquity, because they were seen as co-equals with their husbands, co-equals with their brothers, far more than the patriarchy that took place in the northern parts of the equator. This is really important for us to put in, because there was a principle from the beginning of time that built communities, societies, into what they became later on, into high elements of culture, which we today call civilization. People were civil. Why? Because of their discipline. Discipline. I'm trying to get this through to you. It's important that, disciplining children comes through the instruction, comes through the text, not something you do afterwards. It has to be blended and amalgamated into the material. This is what's important. And this is what the ancient Kemites did. Okay, she was queen consort, etc. So just to emphasize this one behind the throne, this was her husband, Amenhotep III. This was her son, Akhenaten. Now, she ruled for over 50 years, approximately 50 years. She was a power behind the throne of her husband, because she was approximately 13 or 40 when she married Amenhotep. He was about in their 50s. Okay, now he was supposed to marry Nefertiti. Okay, but by the time Nefertiti got there, because Nefertiti was from Persia, he had died. Okay, so what happened? Queen T married Nefertiti to her son, Akhenaten, who's the oldest one. But Akhenaten, when he took over, he's known to be the heretic king because he came with a concept of monotheism, where the Hamim priesthood were opposed to it because it had multiplicity of gods. She had to take the power of her husband. She actually was the power behind Akhenaten because he migrated with Nefertiti to another place. The mother was the one, he was one of those, he was a vegetarian. He didn't like killing animals. He didn't even want to rule. His mother was the ruler behind that. But if you watch National Geographic and all these programs, they do not talk about this woman. She was also the power behind Semenkare. Semenkare was her other son. And then you had King Tut, who's believed to be her son. Some say a stepson. But when King Tut comes in and becomes a ruler, that was when Queen Tia died. This is important. So she was the head. So she ruled Egypt behind the part. She wielded power behind men for Egypt for nearly 50 years or over 50 years. Okay, and this is important. She was writing letters and dispatchments, etc., all around the empire to allying kings from other regions and all the rest of stuff. And she kept the whole thing together. And that's all what through education. Yeah, she was a power behind 4 men. She kept that country together militarily, socially, politically, religiously, spiritually, philosophically, and she was educated as well. So let's have a look at some of the things here. She stabilized a dynasty during 4 critical periods. The 4 critical periods was one of her husbands, 3 of her sons, or 2 of her sons, 1 of her stepsons, which is King Tut. Okay? When her husband became old, she wielded power in Africa and Asia. And I'm not going to read any more of this. I just want you to see the type of realm that these women controlled. This is the empire that this woman controlled. Have a look at what she controlled for 50 years. And no invasion came into her country. No invasion came into this woman's country. This is what she controlled. Most of Sudan, most of Libya, all of Egypt, yeah, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, right up to northern Iraq. That was this woman's empire. Literally, this is what she controlled. And women in ancient Egypt, because she was Nubian, women in ancient Egypt, they revered this woman. They would copy her hairstyles. You know, see how the weave of what black women are wearing, which is white women's hair. It was the other way around with Queen Tea. People would have Afro weaves to put on their heads. They imitated this Nubian woman. It was in reverse. This is how powerful she was. And we know that the first people to use makeup in any sort of way were the Nubian women. So the reality is that it is really important for us to understand ancient history, to understand why things are the way they are today. Yeah, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. So why do we do what we do today? Where did we lose things? How do we forget things, etc.? This is something that we really need to understand. So let's have a look at the other slide, because we are coming to an end. Okay, I'm just going to give me 10 minutes to run through these slides, and we're going to have a look at some of the stuff. And so here, this is Hannibal of Carthage. Now, there was a movie which was done using this black actor here, because Hannibal was black. They've had to whitewash him over the years, etc. I'm not here to really deal with his skin color. What I'm trying to do, I'm trying to emphasize the importance of education within Africa. We're going to look at education slowly in North Africa now. Okay, they talk about the Punic War or the Carthaginian Empire, but this is a coin of Hannibal and his elephant, Surus. This was actually found in Italy, and they've actually found coins in North Africa. And you can see from the coin, what you call it. You can see from the coin, it's an African individual. You can see the thick lips, the curly hair, you know, the broad nose, etc. That's Hannibal himself. This depiction of a person, what they call Hannibal today, is just a falsification. And there's a reason for this now, because what you're going to see now, you're going to see the destruction of African literary skills, colleges, universities, libraries. You're going to see this destruction now, why we're in the situation that we are today. Right, these are the Phoenicians or the Canaanites, okay? These are the people who founded Carthage in North Africa, which is in Tunisia, around about 814 BCE. This is what they look like. And this is them giving tribute to the ancient Egyptians. That's how the Canaanites or the people of Syria, Lebanon, yeah, and most of Palestine looked at that time. Okay, so we're going to look at the destruction of African literature, knowledge, and educational institutions. So let me just run through these. The Library of Carthage, okay, 146 BC, okay, was burned to the ground, literally burned to the ground by the Romans. It had over 500,000 volumes of the ancient world put to flames on papyrus. Those which were done into stone were broken up deliberately. So now you can see where African culture and primary sources of Africa is literally being destroyed. Then there was another cataclysm that takes place, the Library of Alexandria in 48 BCE under Caesar, okay? The result of this Library of Alexandria, which eventually became the intellectual jewel of the ancient world. Okay, there was no libraries at that time not much of libraries. If they were libraries in Europe, they were public, they were more private libraries. They wasn't access for the commoners or for the local people. Little is known about the site's physical layout, but at its peak, it may have included over 500,000 papyrus scrolls. Can you imagine that? So now you're seeing where all this literature for thousands of years are now being put to flames. The educational element of instruction is now come to an end. Okay, so when the Romans and the Greeks went in there was an element of preservation, especially when the Greeks went in there. But there was elements of destruction by interlopers and outsiders coming into the continent, yeah, and destroying and causing destruction. And then the Library of Alexandria is looted in 389 AD by Emperor Theodosius of the Romans, literally looted and taken back to what was now called as Constantinople. Okay, some of them they couldn't read because they couldn't read the language, so those works were destroyed, especially a lot of the religious texts, etc. So we have to understand the destruction that takes place as far as the African continent is concerned, with its libraries, with its education, its intellectual tradition, literally comes to an end. And I did that picture there. I'm going to just run through this on the Moors and we can have a little break and question and answers. So that comes to an end. Then all of a sudden, Islam rises, etc., around about the 7th century AD in Arabia, etc. Africans comes in, involved with that. They inherit a lot of the tradition that comes out of ancient Egypt. If you read a book called Stolen Legacy by George V.M. James, he talks about the Africans in East Africa, North Africa, as well as West Africa, became the custodians of ancient Kemetic or ancient Egyptian religion or history or literary elements, where some of those things were actually memorized on these people and it was passed down from one generation to another. Now, these people are going to become Muslim now. So let's have a talk about who the Moors were, because people have a problem who the Moors were, etc. And this is how dark-skinned people, as far as education is concerned, have been written out of history. So it says around 46 BC, the Roman army entered West Africa. So that was when they burnt the Library of Carthage 100 years before. So they end up stretching. So it takes 100 years for them to get from Tunisia right over to West Africa. That's how long it took them, 100 years, the Romans. But when they got to West Africa, they encountered Black Africans, who they called Moris, from the Greek adjective, which is moros, meaning black or dark. That's what Moors meant. Moors didn't actually mean Muslim, because Islam doesn't come until 600 years later. So Moor, the word Moor actually was like calling someone black. That's what the word Moor meant, a dark-skinned person. It was an adjective. Like Ethiopia today means burnt face. That's what it means, people with dark complexion, if you want to translate it in the English language. And then we got the University of Salamanca. Look at the university. This was built by West Africans. Why is this written out of the history books? You can see these circular globes they were teaching from. In 1492, when Columbus was going on his voyages, etc., they still believed in Europe that the world was flat. You'd fall off the edge. And you've got this Moorish globe in the University of Salamanca, where they're asking people, Africans, are basically teaching from circular globes. This is how advanced Moorish culture was. And this is what they were teaching there: agriculture, art, and architecture, philosophy. So they now become the custodians of the ancient Kemetic tradition, ancient Nubian tradition of education. And they brought that into Europe. Europe had no universities until the Moors came in. When the Moors came in, they had constructed 17 top-class university complexes throughout Europe. Some of them was in Spain, some was in Portugal, and some was obviously in Sardinia and places in Italy and all those places. This is how the Renaissance is going to come out now, because the Moors had laid the foundation of education, and education was based upon social equality. It meant that males can study alongside females. They only started doing that recently within the Western world. This is how advanced this was. So the reality, what I'm trying to emphasize here, that education was important. It was about building the individual who can actually build a society. It was not based upon a job. And this is just something I want to look at. I'm going to look at one Moorish individual who was born a slave in Mesopotamia. He was educated in Baghdad. In 1822, he decides to go to Al-Andalus or Andalusia, which is now Spain and Portugal. And he's trained in Mesopotamia, in the university, in the House of Wisdom. It's believed to be in the House of Wisdom. Botany. He was a botanist. Okay, but when he went into Al-Andalus, etc., he developed innovations that are with us today from this African mind. Okay, dress styles for 4 seasons. There was only 2 seasons in the 9th century. Only 2 seasons in Europe. Okay, winter and summer. He invented autumn and spring and put that into the mix. So when you say autumn and spring, it came out of an African mind. He was the one which created the 3-course meal. And a 3-course meal is a way of recycling and reducing waste, because in the Moorish courts within Spain and Portugal, they were extravagant. So we decided to systematize food by starting off with a soup, then a main course, and then a dessert. So the 3-course meal that we see in restaurants today came out of an African mind. Different forms of hairstyles, use of crystal wear. But what I want to point your mind to is the last 4. This individual by the name of Viryab. He had created the beginnings of toothpaste, soap, washing powder, and deodorant, and that's something which is within the market today. So we all use those throughout, we use those every day, literally. Literally, we use that every day. So hygiene amongst the things. So that's what I mean about education, or the subject should not be called a subject. It's a discipline, okay? It's a discipline. And that's what they were able to do as Moors in Europe through education. Education was about improving your condition to improve the condition of others. And hygiene was part and parcel of that makeup. What I want to emphasize here before I go on, that when we're looking at the beauty industry, the hair and beauty industry, okay, through all the colleges, do you know the first hair and beauty college was opened up was in the 9th century by this person, Viryab? He actually was teaching hair and beauty. So the hair and beauty and the cosmetic industry, this man pioneered in the 9th century. In the 9th century, this man pioneered. And now we're looking at these things as being something new in Western society, in many of the colleges, college complexes within England and Wales. It was an African that established this. The importance of not just being clean, but looking good, looking smart. This is what it was about. So there's 3 university complexes here, which I'm going to talk about. University of Timbuktu, known as the University of Sankore. Okay, this is in Mali. You got Al-Azhar University. This is in Egypt. And the Qarawin, not the Kairouan, Qayrawin University, which is in Fez in Morocco. These university complexes was either financed or built by women. And this is during the Islamic period. So this concept that education and Muslim women can be educated, this blows it straight out of the water. There was a Mandinka woman that laid the foundation for the University of Timbuktu in Sankore, okay? It was her that financed that. There was another one. These are all dark-skinned women who inherited and spent their money on the community. Even Malcolm X himself said, when he went to places like Egypt, and he went to places like Syria, and he went to places like, Algeria. When Malcolm X came back, he said he noticed two things. He says, when a woman was educated, she educated not just her family, she educated the society. It's what Malcolm X said. But when a man got educated, he only educated himself as an individual. So this is an important thing. This is with his own observation. This is what he said with his own observation. But there's also a tradition in Islam that says that if a man educates himself and a woman educates an entire family. So women are the educators of the next generation, and that should be understood. The early principles of socialization, you know, not so much should rely on the woman, but they are the primary teachers and trainers of children. Maybe that's one of the reasons why women are the monopoly in the educational system, especially in primary school and most of the secondary schools. It's women. So there is something, you know, meticulous about what Malcolm X said and what we see in contemporary society today. Okay, let's have a break now. Let's go on for 10 minutes, you know, have a drink, etc., etc. I'll try and unmute everyone if I can, and we shall have a little rest. Any questions at all? If you want to type your questions in, please do. If not, I will try to unmute you. Let me see if I can. What's wrong with this? Why won't it unmute? Anyone have anything to say? Probably need to go into participants, right? Let's have a look. Participants. No, it's not allowing me for some reason. It's telling me if I go into participants to invite and then opening up emails. Right, oh, let's have a look. It's not allowed. Why didn't it allow me to do it? Right, mute all. Right, for some reason I can't unmute you for some reason, guys, so please forgive me. Write your information on the chat and I will read. Sorry, I muted myself, sorry. Yeah, write your information to a chat and what I will do, I'll try and get back to you. For some reason, it won't allow me to unmute you.
Hi,
Oh, I can hear something.
Hi, Abu-Bakr. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hi. Good morning or afternoon, wherever you guys are.
Yeah.
Everyone. What I wrote on the forum is first I'll just quickly introduce myself. I'm actually a former student of Abu-Bakr. I've actually taken this class, I think, back in 2013.
Okay.
In the Cardiff University, and so I took it with yourself, Abu-Bakr. And the comment that I put on the chat there is that the thing about what to appreciate about history is that it's sometimes, and probably most of the times, it's pseudo history because history is recorded based on the information that's available at the time. So for many of us, this is either new information or conflicting information or information that complements the narrative that we already had of just education in general. So I was just hoping if nobody has any specific questions, perhaps have an open discussion as to where were you and where you are currently now and where you hope to be with the information that one has collected from today or previous lectures taken.
Okay.
I don't know. I just thought that was an idea if nobody is able, has any specific questions on that.
what I'm going to do, Abdurrahman, because a few people have been typing while I was talking, so I'm just going to see if there's any questions in the chat, and then we can go back to that then, yeah? But if anybody wants to say anything, any questions, and then we can open up what you said, Abdurrahman, for that discussion. Okay, Finland, okay, they've answered that for me. Okay, that was when it starts at 7. 7 years old is the same in Islam. Yes, that's true. The same in Islam, you know, that the education start for a child, age of 7. So give them time to play, give them time to grow up, to mature. This is what it's about. And most psychologists now are agreeing with this. Another question for later, was the Kemetic system evident across other parts of Africa? Yes, may not been at the time, because everything was pulled up to ancient Egypt or to the place in Egypt, especially in Upper Egypt. But the fact is, many of them went back to their areas like, you know, Chad or Libya or the Congo, and taught their people, opened up similar schools, etc. So it was across large parts of Africa, the educational system. And we're seeing this now for a lot of the archaeological digs that are coming up. At Ruth, okay, that's okay. This is such an important session. That's by Liz. Yes, it certainly is. There should be more teachers here. I agree. He was able to trace this by buildings and already were built prior to Kemet time in language. Okay, that's talking to someone else. I think that is. This has been really helpful. I will watch the rest later. Okay, that's Julian. Okay, thank you for sharing the truth, April. Thank you very much. Probably need to go into practice. Okay, that's okay, yeah. I can't mute myself, Liz. I don't know what to do. I've muted everyone, Liz. But
Abu, it's okay now. Yeah.
Oh, right, okay. Do you want to ask a question, Liz, at all, or?
Well, I just wanted to comment to say how absolutely fascinating it is.
Good.
And I'm really delighted that you're doing these sessions. And to have this one on education, I mean, this was absolutely all new information. I knew about the Timbuktu libraries, but I didn't know about the others that you've been talking about, and so much detail about the, you know, the actual structure of the programs and how the teaching went on. I have found that absolutely fantastic, and I think it's really important that teachers understand that, you know, there is this African history. If we're going to put, you know, about Black history into the curriculum, then teachers need to be saying, well, of course, you know, back in such and such a, you know, say the times, in Africa, there was there were fabulous universities, etc., and have some way, and also share this with the children through a children's book, children's material. So I'm really, really keen to support in any way I can.
Oh, thank you very much, Liz. And you've been a support to me in the past as well, you know, through education, etc. So
good to see you, Abu. I didn't like to be too personal.
Yeah, you have. So definitely, yeah. Any support you can give me, yeah, definitely.
Lovely.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Liz. Right, let me just go through some of these questions here. I think there was a couple more what people were asking. Ruth, fascinating. Was education open to all or dependent on economic status, etc.? Thank you. Well, education in Africa wasn't really stratified like it was in Europe. Like I said, they allowed females to be educated alongside males. Okay, because if we look at some of the programs or so, we read some of the documentation, what takes place in ancient Egypt, say for instance, we know that women can rule alongside men. Women were involved in the legal system besides men, in the political system besides men. So, yeah, was education stratified? Only up to a certain point, I would say. It was open to all in the sense commoners can go, to many of those institutions, like the University of Ipet Isut. This wasn't housed by wealthy, you know, children of wealthy men and women. Even though they would have seen the importance of education, even poor people, even commoners can go there, because the likes of Imhotep, for instance, was considered a commoner, but he was a multi-genius. He's the one who built the step pyramids, etc. So we do have documented evidence that lowly people within the social structure of ancient Egyptian or Nubian society could gain upward mobility through an element of meritocracy. They were rewarded for the hard work they did in universities, such as Ipet Isut. So it wasn't stratified as much, and status didn't determine who you could be or what you was. Okay, so I hope I've answered that, Ruth. I just grabbed the book off my shelf, University Plan Architecture, The Search for Perfection. Okay, you said that the sculptures had their noses removed. Okay, to take away the African features in art history. We were told, oops, someone just moved, hold on a sec, sculptures of the nose happened in Greek sculpture due to the structure and the fact that that stuck out. This is new knowledge for me, blah, blah, blah. Well, this is a falsified thing. The ancient Egyptians, to give an example, just to explain this point about sculptures and nose breaking, etc., they were perfectionists. The pyramids are still standing even till today. You mean to tell me that they wouldn't be able to create noses on statues to last to the end of time? This is what we have to understand. They were perfectionists. They were building to a God concept for lifetime, not like how building structures taking place today, whereby people build buildings for the same fact that it has 100 years lifespan. Then they knock it down and build it again. This was not the concept. Everything was about longevity, shelf life, and preservation. Because they saw buildings like culture. It should be preserved, it should be built, it should be preserved. And this is the African understanding of subject and object polarity. It's about preservation. Okay. Thank you so much for answering my questions. I think it's great how the first part of the session illustrated. Whoops, illustrated. This is from Ruth. Illustrated the Black history is the beginning of history. So everyone's history and hence, okay, thank you, Ruth. That's good. Ruth, exactly, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, right. We'll have another 5 minutes, guys. I'm gonna go and powder my nose. And what we will do then is we do the second part, and this is more contemporary. This is more to do with us today. We're gonna look at the national curriculum, the new Welsh curriculum, and how Black history will have a role in there, whether it's a semi-role, a full role, a partial role, etc. That's up for discussion. And then what we'll do when I come back, I'll just open up the question to what Abdurrahman said, and then we will start the next session. So I'm going to pause this now.